Well, so far we've focused almost all of our attention on a thin strip of real estate stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland, the notorious Western Front. So, what's happening in the East? The Schlieffen Plan was based on the theory that Britain would remain neutral, Germany would defeat France quickly, and then the German army would swing east and take out Russia. Well, Britain, as it turns out, did enter the war. The German troops were halted 25 miles from Paris, and there they and the French and the British stayed for the next 4 years. And things did not go quite as planned in the East either. Russia, in particular, mobilized faster than Germany had predicted and invaded East Prussia. But this front did not bog down in the trenches, at least not in quite the same way. In the East, Germany kept or really regained the offensive, and in August 1914, that's a month before the French and the Germans are duking it out at the Battle of the Marne, the Germans won a decisive victory over the Russians at the Battle of Tannenberg. More than 140,000 Russians were killed or captured in this battle. One of Russia's most famous authors, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, wrote a novel about this battle based on extensive interviews and archive research. His account is in your readings, and you should look at it now. By 1917, Germany had conquered swaths of former Russian territory. More than 3 million Russians were dead from battle or from war-related diseases and famine, and in fact, many estimates are much, much higher. So it's no great surprise, really, that in 1917 Russia erupted in revolution, and then 6 months later in another revolution. So I want to begin with this introductory clip about the Russian Revolution. Again, an introduction to this important topic. We've already identified one pretty clear cause of the Russian Revolution. Losing battles and racking up death tolls of over 1 million are not good for any government that wants to stay in power. But early on in this course, we talked about how there are usually many causes for a historical event, and we've seen that with World War I, right? So as you watch this introductory video, I want you to think about other possible causes of revolution besides the carnage of World War I. Well, the men who led Europe into World War I were not always the brightest bulbs, I think of Kaiser Wilhelm, but Nicholas was dimmer than most. One of his biggest mistakes was to trust a truly bizarre holy man, Rasputin, who claimed to be able to cure their hemophiliac son. So let's just see a short clip from the Discovery Channel about this scary and fascinating man and how he became the virtual and deeply unpopular ruler of Russia. I'm not going to tell you all the creepy bits, but Ms. Jacobs may. So we've identified two causes of the Russian Revolution, a disastrous war and a disastrous ruler. But there were other deep-seated problems in Russia. This was a country that had only abolished serfdom in 1861. Nobles continued to own most of the land, and peasants often lived on the brink or over the brink of starvation. It would not be a Mrs. McConnell podcast without a chart, would it? So, peasants, often newly freed serfs, were also hungry for land. So what do we learn about land ownership from this chart? Who were the biggest landowners? The government is the biggest landowner. Also peasant allotments, which is a little confusing, but it really means land that's held in common by the Mir or Zemstva village committees that were often controlled by nobles. So in other words, you had a kind of collective ownership of the land. Only 1.3% of the land was owned outright by peasant individuals. Note that the church owned 6 times as much, and nobles owned significantly more than that as well. The figure on the left is an amount in millions. The figure on the right is a percent. It's pretty clearly labeled. So, peasant agriculture still dominated Russia at the beginning of World War I. But Russia was in the process of becoming an industrial power, mostly, by the way, with capital invested from France. And because Russia came late to the Industrial Revolution, its factories tended to be larger than the early factories in England and Germany. I looked at least one study that indicated that as many as 50% of Russian industrial workers toiled in factories of over 1,000 employees. Those are big factories by European standards. What difference might it make if your goal was to start a revolution that people worked in large factories? Well, if you're trying to organize a workers' revolution, it's easier when there are a lot of workers crammed together in a small space. And in fact, the workers' Soviets that the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, the two competing groups of socialists, were able to organize were very effective, partly because people weren't in a closed space. Let me just say that the infighting among the different socialist groups in Russia is very interesting and very complicated. And I basically decided not to focus in on it. But if you'd like to know more about that, either Ms. Jacobs or I would be happy to tell you more or to help you find out where to get that information. So anyway, Russia had a very weak parliament. It had grown weaker since the Tsar had been forced to accept a parliament after an earlier revolt in 1905 that I would love to be talking about, but is another thing I've decided not to try to get to in this lecture. At any rate, early in 1917, the leader of this legislature, the Duma, the Russian legislature, by the way, is called a Duma now, the leader wrote a frantic letter to the Tsar. What is this letter saying? Well, now that you've read this message, let's see what finally lit the match that ignited the explosion and brought down the Russian government. Another video clip. Okay, now that you've seen the video clip, who made the revolution? Well, for all the debate over whether it will be intellectuals or workers or peasants who start the revolution, I think a good argument could be made that the critical turning point in most revolutions is the point when the people who hold the guns, the soldiers, maybe the police, change their allegiance and turn their guns against the authorities that have employed them to keep everyone else under control. By the way, keep this image in mind because interestingly enough, toward the end of this course, we're going to see the tables turn and we're going to see the army revolt against the communists. So, I've been talking about causes of the revolution, and I'm a little concerned, I'm channeling Ms. Jacobs here, that the timeline has gotten confusing. So let's stop, backtrack a little, and make sure that we have the sequence of events straight. Let me just note, Russian dates are very confusing. There are usually 2 dates given for every event. I just put it in once here to show it to you. And that's because Russia did not get around to switching to the Western calendar that we use until after the revolution. So I'm using Western dates. It's an arbitrary choice. In order to help you keep the chronology straight, I am again going to backtrack a little, and I'm going to show a different video. This opens in 1915 with the Tsar's decision to assume personal command of Russia's troops at the front. So, the demonstrations that brought down the Tsar began in Petrograd, or St. Petersburg, which is what had been called until 1914, or Leningrad, which it was called from 1924 until 1991, when it became St. Petersburg again. Is that confusing enough? Anyway, the demonstrations combined with the army mutinies that we just saw doomed the Tsar. He abdicated, his brother refused the throne, and a new constitutional government was established. Well, one problem with spending so much time on czars and the wonderfully creepy Rasputin is I have not talked enough about Lenin, and I feel as if I've run out of time. We are going to return to Lenin and to his successor Stalin in the next unit. I'm going to talk more about the rise of dictatorships, Nazi and communist. But for now, we're focusing on how the Bolsheviks seized power, and really even more on how the old regime fell. But I want to end with a little bit of a look at Lenin's justification for the Bolsheviks seizing power. So, Lenin was a radical socialist, a self-proclaimed communist, but he came to power by making promises that appealed to a wide base of Russians: land, peace, and bread. And in particular, he very consciously reached out to the peasants, who were not the natural support base, if you will, for communists, and on whom, frankly, he was going to turn in a couple of years. But for now, the peasants wanted land. The soldiers wanted an end to the murderous war. Starving peasants, soldiers, and workers alike wanted food. But Lenin had much bigger plans for transforming Russia. And in fact, he worried that by giving land to peasants, they would become too conservative. He was not about to put mere workers and peasants in charge of something as important as the world's first communist revolution. So I'm going to end with a very famous essay that Lenin wrote almost 2 decades before the Russian Revolution, when he laid out his plans for a communist takeover in Russia. What is to be done was the question he asked, and how does he answer this? Well, this is not easy to understand, but what Lenin is basically saying is that workers are not ready to make a revolution. And really, they can't be trusted with a revolution. Socialist thinkers such as Lenin will make revolution for the workers, and maybe they will eventually, quote, acquire the knowledge. In other words, maybe the workers eventually will catch up to Lenin. Does this sound a little bit like czars ruling the people as father figures, looking after the people's interests, supposedly, but not giving them much say in deciding what those interests should be? Well, in the final quarter of the course, we're going to continue to follow this experiment until it collapses with the Berlin Wall in 1989.